Having the World in View, Essays on Kant, Hegel, and Sellars by John McDowell. Quotes: Having the World in View, Essays on Kant, Hegel, and Sellars by John McDowell explores the intricate relationships among the philosophical insights of Immanuel Kant, G.W.F. Hegel, and Wilfrid Sellars. McDowell delves into how these thinkers engage with themes such as intentionality, rationality, perception, and the connection between thought and the world. By bridging these philosophical traditions, McDowell offers a nuanced account of how our conceptual capacities are intertwined with our perceptual experiences, aiming to resolve long-standing issues about subjectivity and the objectivity of knowledge. This collection is a vital contribution to understanding the continuity and evolution of German idealism and analytic philosophy. Quote 1. Sellars' master thought in Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind is this: there is a special category of characterizations of states or episodes that occur in people's lives. For instance, characterizations of states or episodes as knowings. And, we might add, corresponding characterizations of the people in whose lives the states or episodes occur. For instance, characterizations of people as knowers. Sellars introduces a significant philosophical notion, asserting that particular characterizations of mental states or episodes, such as knowings, occupy a unique position in understanding human experience. He contends that these characterizations are not merely descriptive, but play a fundamental role in framing our interpretation and understanding of mental states as they relate to knowledge and the capability of individuals as knowers. This concept challenges simpler, descriptive views of mental states by emphasizing their integral role in the broader framework of epistemology and cognition. Quote 2. Assuming this interpretation for the moment, we can bring Sellars' thought into direct contact with Kant. The logical space of reasons on this reading is the logical space in which we place episodes or states when we describe them in terms of the actualization of conceptual capacities. Connecting Sellars' ideas to Kantian philosophy, this interpretation asserts that the logical space of reasons involves the actualization of conceptual capacities. This suggests that human cognition and understanding are grounded not just in the passive reception of sensory data, but in the active, conceptual engagement with this data. This link to Kant's philosophy places a strong emphasis on the role of the mind's active faculties in shaping our perception and knowledge of the world, highlighting a dynamic interplay between sensory experience and conceptual interpretation. Quote 3. Early in Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind, Sellars diagnoses the classical concept of a sense datum as a mongrel resulting from a crossbreeding of two ideas. First, an idea of non-concept involving sensory episodes, such as sensations of red, and, second, an idea of non-inferential knowings that such and such is the case. Sellars critiques the traditional concept of sense data, which he believes erroneously combines non-conceptual sensory experiences with non-inferential knowledge claims. He challenges the coherence of this blend, arguing that sensory experiences do not inherently carry with them knowledge claims without conceptual mediation. This critique is aimed at refining our understanding of how sensory experiences contribute to knowledge, emphasizing the need for a conceptual framework to bridge the gap between mere sensations and epistemic assertions. Quote 4. Sellars describes the logical space of reasons as the space of justifying and being able to justify what one says. Sellars articulates a fundamental aspect of his philosophical perspective, emphasizing that the logical space of reasons involves a dynamic and interactive domain where justification is not only given, but also demanded. This delineation helps underscore the idea that engaging in rational discourse requires participants to support their claims with reasons that can withstand scrutiny, fostering a deeper understanding of how beliefs and assertions function within our cognitive and social practices. Quote 5. Sellars addresses the question whether empirical knowledge has foundations. His answer is nuanced. This quote captures Sellars' approach to the traditional philosophical question about the foundational nature of empirical knowledge. He challenges the straightforward acceptance of empirical data as the ultimate basis of knowledge, proposing instead a more complex interrelation where empirical knowledge both influences and is influenced by conceptual frameworks. This nuanced stance points to a dynamic and reciprocal relationship between observation and theory in the formation of knowledge. Sellars' quote 6 picture has elements both above and below a line that importantly shapes his thinking. The line separates characterizations of occurrences in people's lives that need to be understood in terms of the actualization of conceptual capacities from characterizations that do not need to be understood in those terms. This quote outlines the dualistic nature of Sellars' approach to understanding human cognition and perceptual experience, emphasizing the distinction between conceptual and non-conceptual elements. The line Sellars refers to serves as a fundamental division within his theoretical framework, distinguishing between elements of experience that involve active conceptual engagement and those that are more passive or sensory. This conceptual framework is critical for dissecting the complexity of human cognition, where some aspects involve deliberate conceptual thinking, while others are more directly related to sensory input. Quote 7. Sellars takes this picture to be fundamentally Kantian, although he complains that Kant failed to make the necessary distinction clear, even to himself. Sellars acknowledges his intellectual debt to Kant, but also critiques Kant for not fully clarifying the distinctions within his own philosophical system. This critique highlights a common challenge in philosophical inquiry, where the nuances and complexities of foundational concepts such as perception and cognition might not be fully expounded by their originators. Sellars' reflection on Kant's work exemplifies the ongoing dialogue within philosophy, where later thinkers refine, challenge, and build upon the ideas of their predecessors to enhance understanding or address unresolved issues. Quote 8. Sellars is firm in his conviction that what Kant usually calls intuitions are representations of individuals that already involve the understanding, the faculty associated with concepts. This statement reflects Sellars' interpretation of Kant's notion of intuitions, where he emphasizes that these are not mere sensory experiences, but are integrally connected with conceptual understanding. Sellars argues that Kantian intuitions are more complex than simple perceptual inputs. They involve an element of understanding, thus blurring the lines between perception and cognition. This interpretation challenges simpler views of sensory experience, suggesting a more intertwined relationship between sensing and conceptualizing in the formation of knowledge. Quote 9. The fact that Sellars finds this implicit conflation in Kant helps to account for some features of the above-the-line notion of intuitions that he finds in Kant. Sellars critiques Kant for what he sees as a conflation or mixing of different levels of cognitive processing within the concept of intuition. This critique is part of Sellars' broader argument that Kant's philosophical framework sometimes inadequately separates more advanced cognitive functions from basic sensory inputs. Sellars' analysis suggests that a clearer distinction is necessary to fully understand the nuances of how humans process and integrate sensory experiences into their cognitive framework. Quote 10. Sellars insists, rightly in my view, that intuitions in the dominant Kantian sense already involve the understanding. I have been expressing this by speaking of intuitions not as conceptual shapings of sensory consciousness, but as shapings of sensory consciousness by the understanding. This assertion emphasizes the inherent complexity of intuitions within Kantian philosophy, as interpreted by Sellars. It highlights the idea that intuitions are not merely passive or purely sensory experiences, but are actively shaped by the understanding. This blending of sensory inputs with cognitive processes challenges simpler views of perception and cognition, suggesting a more dynamic interplay where sensory experiences are intrinsically tied to conceptual understanding. Quote 11. In the passage in the Clue, Kant speaks of the mere synthesis of various representations in an intuition. The insertion of mere synthesis implicitly differentiates the unity of an intuition from the unity of a judgment. This quote underscores Kant's nuanced view of the mental processes involved in forming intuitions as compared to judgments. The term mere synthesis suggests that the process of forming intuitions is more straightforward and less deliberative than that of forming judgments, which involve a more active, cognitive unification of concepts. This distinction is crucial in understanding the different levels of cognitive engagement required in the perception and judgment processes within Kantian theory. Quote 12. Sellars's complaint is that the characteristics of the representations of receptivity as such, which is what should properly be meant by the forms of sensibility, are never adequately discussed, and the so-called forms of sensibility become ever more clearly. As the argument of the critique proceeds, forms of conceptual representations. Here, Sellars critiques Kant for not sufficiently exploring or clarifying the role of sensibility independent of conceptual understanding. Sellars points out that as Kant's arguments in the critique progress, the discussion about sensibility's forms increasingly conflates with conceptual representations. This critique addresses a perceived oversight in Kant's work, suggesting a need for a clearer distinction or more thorough exploration of the purely sensory aspects of human cognition. Sellars's quote 13 complaint leaves no room for this reading. The complaint implies that as he reads Kant, the idea that space informs an outward directedness of subjectivity cannot be understood independently of the idea that objects are available to outer intuition on the first interpretation of the term, according to which intuitions are shapings of sensibility by the understanding. Sellars, again, critiques Kant, this time on the interpretation of space as it relates to subjective experience and its outward orientation. This critique reflects Sellars' broader concern with Kant's conceptual framework, particularly how Kant articulates the relationship between spatial understanding and sensory perception. Sellars suggests that Kant's model inadequately separates spatial understanding from its instantiation in sensory experience, indicating a need for a clearer or alternative conceptualization. Quote 14. But Sellars thinks that to be fully Kantian, the picture needs a further element. He thinks this idea of conceptual shapings of visual consciousness is something we can entitle ourselves to only by means of a transcendental postulation, according to which these conceptual shapings of visual consciousness are guided by manifolds of sheer receptivity. Here, Sellars argues for a transcendental component to fully grasp the Kantian view of visual experiences. He suggests that our conceptual understanding of these experiences is contingent upon acknowledging an underlying layer of non-conceptual input, which he terms sheer receptivity. This element provides the necessary grounding for our conceptual interpretations, ensuring that our perceptions are not merely subjective constructions, but are connected to an objective reality. Quote 15. In holding that a properly Kantian view requires this guidance by sheer receptivity, Sellars commits himself to taking a dim view of some features of the first critique. Sellars's insistence on the necessity of sheer receptivity for a fully Kantian understanding of perception leads him to critique aspects of Kant's critique of pure reason. He perceives shortcomings in Kant's discussion of sensibility and its role in shaping our conceptual understanding of experiences. This critical stance underscores Sellars's commitment to a more integrated view of sensibility and understanding, which he believes is essential for a coherent philosophical account of perception. Quote 16. Sellars shows us how to understand visual experiences as ostensible seeings, occurrences in a subject's visual life that contain claims about an ostensibly visible region of objective reality. Sellars elucidates how visual experiences encompass more than just sensory perception. They involve conceptual processes that assert claims about the visible environment. This perspective aligns visual perception closely with cognitive processes, suggesting that what we see is not merely registered, but interpreted and integrated within a conceptual framework of understanding, demonstrating the intertwined nature of perception and cognition in constructing our reality. Quote 17. Now obviously, this mismatch between what Kant wrote about forms of sense and what Sellars thinks he ought to have written should give us pause. Sellars critically evaluates Kant's work on the forms of sensibility, suggesting a disconnect between Kant's descriptions and what Sellars perceives as necessary for a complete philosophical framework. This critique is reflective of the dynamic nature of philosophical inquiry, where interpretations and expectations can lead to significant reassessments of foundational theories, highlighting the evolving understanding of philosophical concepts over time. Quote 18. Our perceptually based beliefs are intelligible as manifestations of rationality. We can make sense of them by putting them in an explanatory nexus with perceptual experience. This quote highlights the role of rationality in shaping our perceptual beliefs, positing that our beliefs are not arbitrary, but are formed through a rational process influenced by our perceptual experiences. This idea underscores the interconnectedness of perception and cognition, suggesting that our sensory experiences do more than just inform us about the environment. They actively shape our beliefs about it through rational processes. Quote 19. I think crediting our perceptual experience with this rational significance is a fundamental insight of empiricism. Here, the importance of rationality in empirical philosophy is emphasized, with the suggestion that understanding perceptual experience through the lens of rationality is key to grasping how we come to know the world. This approach argues that perception is not a passive receipt of sensory data, but an active, rational interpretation that forms the basis of our empirical knowledge. Quote 20. This conception of our perceptual experience bears a resemblance to Kant's conception of empirical intuitions. The connection made between the described concept of perceptual experience and Kant's theory of empirical intuitions illustrates a philosophical lineage and evolution in thought. By likening contemporary views of perception as rational processes to Kant's ideas about sensory receptivity being structured by categories, a bridge is built that connects modern philosophical discussions with classical Kantian themes, enriching the understanding of both. Quote 21. Kant introduces the understanding, the seat of conceptual capacities, by contrasting it with the receptivity of sensibility. This quote reflects on Kant's dualistic view of human cognition, which distinguishes between the understanding, responsible for conceptual thought, and sensibility, which deals with sensory input. Kant sees these two aspects as fundamentally different but interrelated, with understanding shaping how we interpret sensory data, a process crucial for forming a coherent view of the world. Quote 22. The spontaneity of knowledge is linked to our conceptual capacities and is contrasted with the passive reception of sensory data, framing understanding as an active process of making sense of our experiences. Kant's idea that knowledge involves an element of spontaneity underscores the active nature of cognition. Instead of passively receiving information, the mind actively organizes and interprets sensory input using its conceptual capacities. This view posits that our understanding of the world is not merely a reflection of what we perceive, but a construction shaped by our cognitive faculties. Quote 23. Our experience can present a shade of color that is as determinate as our ability to discriminate shades can make it. A determinate shade is present in a sensory way to the subject of such an experience. The emphasis here is on the nuanced capability of perceptual experience to present sensory information such as color shades in a highly specific and determinate manner, aligning closely with the subject's discriminative capacities. This presentation is not just a passive reception, but involves an active conceptual processing, linking sensory input directly with rational cognitive processes. Quote 24. In disallowing my proposal that actualizations of conceptual capacities can present things in a sensory way, Ayres assumes a sharp separation between the sensory and the intellectual. This quote critiques the assumption that there is a rigid division between sensory experiences and intellectual activities. It challenges the notion that conceptual and intellectual engagements are entirely distinct from sensory perceptions, arguing instead for a more integrated understanding where sensory inputs are processed through intellectual and conceptual frameworks. Quote 25. But such a separation is not uncontentiously correct. If a dualism of intellect and senses is merely assumed, it is question-begging to exploit it against me. Here, the argument against an assumed dualism between the senses and the intellect is furthered by pointing out that such a foundational assumption needs more rigorous justification than it typically receives. This quote pushes against traditional dichotomies in philosophy that separate the sensory from the cognitive, suggesting that these elements are more interconnected than often presumed. Quote 26. Actualizations of conceptual capacities, capacities that belong to their subject's rationality, can present things in a sensory way, and that gives the lie to the dualism. This statement asserts that conceptual capacities which are inherently part of a subject's rationality can indeed mediate sensory experiences. This perspective offers a rebuttal to the strict dualism between sensory perception and intellectual conceptualization, proposing instead that sensory experiences are infused with rational and conceptual elements, thereby challenging traditional separations in philosophical thought about perception. Quote 27. Donald Davidson notoriously claimed that nothing can count as a reason for holding a belief, another belief. I objected that this does not accommodate the role of experience in making beliefs rationally intelligible. This quote reflects on Donald Davidson's philosophical stance that reasons for beliefs are fundamentally based on other beliefs, critiquing it from the perspective that such a view does not sufficiently account for the role of sensory and experiential inputs in forming rational beliefs. It highlights a key philosophical debate about the foundations of rationality and the sources from which rational beliefs can derive, suggesting a broader framework that includes experiential factors. Quote 28. In my mind and world, I recommended a conception of perceptual experience as actualization of conceptual capacities in sensory consciousness, on the ground that such a conception opens a path between a mythical given and a coherentism that does not give the world a satisfactory position in the credentials of empirical belief. This quote highlights the philosophical approach of conceptualizing perceptual experience as an interaction between sensory inputs and conceptual capacities. This perspective aims to bridge the gap between the concept of an unmediated sensory given, which cannot fully account for empirical beliefs, and a purely coherentist view, which might undervalue the role of the external world in shaping those beliefs. Quote 29. Sensibility, the capacity for sensory consciousness, is clearly in some sense a natural endowment. But talk of conceptual capacities belongs in what Wilfrid Sellars calls the logical space of reasons. This statement contrasts the inherent biological aspects of sensory perception, sensibility, with the intellectual operations, conceptual capacities, that interpret these perceptions within a rational framework. It underscores a fundamental philosophical discussion about the intersection of our natural sensory abilities and our culturally and intellectually developed capacities for reasoning. Quote 30. I dissolved this seeming difficulty by invoking the familiar but easily forgotten notion of second nature. What is natural need not be equated with what is explicable by the natural sciences. Second nature is nature too. Here, the concept of second nature is used to reconcile the naturalistic aspects of human perception with the higher-order conceptual processes that are not typically within the scope of natural sciences. This concept supports the idea that human experiences and cognitive processes, while not always directly observable or measurable, are as natural as biological processes. Quote 31. In leaving nature behind, Pippin argued that I should not have dragged nature in at all. I objected that he was casting nature as a direct participant in my attempt to show how the world can figure in the warrant for empirical thinking. This quote refers to a critical interaction with the philosopher Robert Pippin, who questioned the relevance of nature in the philosophical discussion about how perceptual experiences contribute to justifying empirical beliefs. The response defends the inclusion of nature in the discussion, suggesting that our natural capabilities are integral to understanding how we engage with and interpret the world. Quote 32. In the Kantian view, our thought and action are not outcomes of natural forces. Pippin's worry about this comes from a natural scientific naturalism, with pretensions to universal scope. This highlights a fundamental debate in philosophy about the extent to which human thought and actions are determined by natural forces, as explored in natural sciences versus being products of free, rational agency. The critique here points to a tension between a Kantian perspective, which sees thought as free from deterministic natural forces, and a more reductionist naturalistic view, which seeks to explain all phenomena, including cognitive processes, in terms of natural laws. Quote 33. Pippin's protest goes beyond the point that the transcendental ideality of space and time is dear to Kant's heart. This quote addresses a deeper philosophical contention about the nature of space and time beyond just their importance to Kantian philosophy. It suggests a broader discussion on how the transcendental ideality of these concepts affects our understanding of the world and our place within it. Quote 34. It is true that thinking a deduction is needed requires that externality. Here, the focus is on the necessity of understanding the concept of externality in Kantian philosophy, particularly in the context of the transcendental deduction. This highlights the importance of recognizing how external elements influence our internal cognitive processes and how these interact to shape our knowledge and perception of the world. Quote 35. What my second reform implies, then, is not that the deduction needs to be recast, but that we are liberated from the apparent need to do what it sets out to do. This statement proposes a significant shift in understanding the role of the transcendental deduction in Kantian thought. It suggests that through a reformation of Kant's original ideas, one can transcend the initial perceived necessity of the deduction, moving towards a more liberated philosophical approach that challenges traditional views on how we attain knowledge. Quote 36. The result of my second reform is no longer Kantian in any but the thinnest sense. This acknowledges the departure from traditional Kantian philosophy that results from proposed reforms. It indicates a transformation in thinking that, while originating from Kantian ideas, evolves into a perspective that diverges significantly from Kant's original doctrines, reflecting a deeper exploration and radicalization of foundational philosophical concepts. Quote 37. That objects are authoritative over thought, certainly over its empirical expression, is a feature of a social practice that has evolved into being as it is. This quote reflects on the authoritative role that objects play over thought within the framework of social practices. It underscores a philosophical understanding of how empirical knowledge and the objects of such knowledge shape and are shaped by the societal contexts in which they evolve, emphasizing the interplay between objectivity and social constructs in the formation of knowledge. Quote 38. Wilfrid Sellars was an important systematic philosopher, not a historian of philosophy, but his own thinking was pervasively shaped by his broad and profound study of the great tradition in philosophy. This quote emphasizes Wilfrid Sellars's engagement with the historical tradition of philosophy, despite his primary focus as a systematic philosopher. It highlights how Sellars's theoretical work was deeply influenced by the philosophical heritage, indicating the continuity and dialogue between past philosophical traditions and contemporary philosophical inquiries. Quote 39. One of Sellars's central doctrines is that the intentionality, the aboutness, of episodes of thought should be modeled on, understood as an extension from, our understanding of the way linguistic performances are meaningful. This statement outlines one of Sellars's key philosophical positions regarding the nature of thought and its relation to language. It suggests that the content or intentionality of thoughts is fundamentally analogous to the way language conveys meaning, positing a foundational link between linguistic expression and cognitive processes. Quote 40. It may help to bring out the flavor of this conception if I mention P.T. Geach's presentation of the same fundamental idea in the guise of an account of judging, which Geach discusses as a paradigmatic mental act. Here, the philosophical idea that judgment or mental acts can be understood in terms of linguistic expressions is explored through the work of P.T. Geach. This perspective views the processes of thought as parallel to linguistic acts, enhancing our understanding of how thoughts are structured and how they relate to the external world. Quote 41. Now it is well known that Thomism includes a version of what Sellars calls the doctrine of the mental word. This quote connects Sellars's philosophy with Thomistic philosophy, specifically the concept of the mental word in Thomism, which parallels Sellars's ideas about the linguistic nature of thought. This connection underscores a significant historical influence on Sellars's thinking and situates his ideas within a broader philosophical context. Quote 42. This Aristotelian isomorphism between intellectual acts and extra-intellectual actualities is an isomorphism of the knower with the known at the intellectual level. Sellars utilizes the concept of Aristotelian isomorphism to explain the correspondence between intellectual acts and the realities they refer to. This philosophical approach posits a form of cognitive symmetry, or equivalence between the structure of thought and the structure of the external world, suggesting a deep-rooted alignment between cognition and reality. Quote 43. Bits of language figure in this Sellarsian account in two different guises. This statement introduces the dual role that language plays in Sellars's philosophy, highlighting how bits of language can be understood both in the context of norm-governed practices, contributing to our understanding of meaning, and as elements within natural occurrences, contributing to the real order of nature. This dual perspective is crucial for comprehending how Sellars views the relationship between linguistic elements, cognition, and the physical world. Quote 44. This structure carries over, by way of the Geach-Sellars analogy, to intellectual episodes. Here, the quote discusses the extension of the previously mentioned dual structure of language to intellectual episodes. By using the Geach-Sellars analogy, this approach frames thoughts and intellectual acts as both elements of the order of signification, where they relate to other elements within the same conceptual realm, and as natural occurrences within the broader physical world. This conceptual framework is fundamental for understanding the complexity of how thoughts are both about something and are natural events. Quote 45. So, intellectual episodes figure in the complete Sellarsian account of them in two guises, just as linguistic performances in the ordinary sense do. This highlights the continuity in Sellars's thought between the nature of language and the nature of intellectual episodes. It underscores the philosophical stance that intellectual activities, like linguistic ones, operate on two levels. They are both part of the normative, symbolic realm of human cognition and also part of the empirical, natural world. This dual perspective is essential for grasping the Sellarsian view of the mind's place in nature. Quote 46. If we describe intellectual acts involving the concept of being a man as isomorphic, in their special way, with actual men, we describe them as standing in a certain relation to actual men. This quote delves into the idea of isomorphism in intellectual acts, suggesting that thinking about concepts involves a form of structural similarity or correspondence with the actual entities those concepts represent. In Sellars's philosophy, this isomorphism is key to understanding how thoughts connect to reality, framing intellectual acts as inherently linked to the objects of their thought through shared structural forms. Quote 47. For Thomism, then, describing intellectual acts in terms of the Aristotelian isomorphism would supposedly capture what they are qua bearers of intentionality. This assertion critiques how Thomism might understand intellectual acts, suggesting that by using Aristotelian isomorphism, Thomistic philosophy may inadvertently conflate the intentional, content-bearing aspect of thoughts with their mere pictorial representation of the world. This critique by Sellars points to a potential philosophical oversight in Thomism, where the essence of thought's content, its intentionality, might be overshadowed by its representational function. Quote 48. Not that it is a case of prediscursive activity, at least if that means that intuiting is a more primitive forerunner of judging. This statement challenges the notion that the process of intuiting, or experiencing sensory or perceptual information, is simply a less developed form of cognitive judgment. It suggests a more nuanced understanding where intuition and judgment are distinct yet interrelated cognitive functions, each with its own complexity, and not necessarily one being more primitive than the other. Quote 49. In this vision, the hallmark of experiences as experiences is their presence to a subject, a presence that mediates the subject's interactions with the environment. This quote emphasizes the role of experiences in mediating the relationship between a subject and their environment, highlighting how experiences serve as a vital link that allows individuals to interact with and respond to their surroundings. It underscores the immediacy and directness with which experiences connect subjects to the world around them. Quote 50. The following proposition, in Kant's terms, a case, a pure concept of the understanding, is a concept of an object in general. Here, the focus is on Kant's philosophical framework, particularly his concept of the understanding as a fundamental aspect of cognition that deals with general concepts of objects. This idea is critical in Kantian philosophy, linking the way we think about objects to the structured and unified way in which our cognition frames these objects within our mental operations. Quote 51. On the account I have been giving, having an object conceptually before one in intuition under a description is essentially being able to think that very thought in discursive activity. This quote delves into the relationship between intuition and discursive thought, arguing that having a conceptual understanding of an object during intuition involves the potential to express that concept through discursive or communicative thought processes. It suggests that intuitive understanding is not isolated, but fundamentally connected to our ability to articulate and reason about our perceptions. Quote 52. In an intuition, an object is present to one whether or not one exploits this potential for discursive activity. This statement highlights a key aspect of intuition, the presence of objects to the perceiver, independent of the individual's active engagement in discursive activities. It points out that the perceptual presence of objects in intuition does not require the perceiver to undertake any additional cognitive processing or articulation, underscoring the direct and immediate nature of intuitive experiences. Quote 53. The nomological irreducibility of the mental does not derive merely from the seamless nature of the world of thought, preference, and intention. This quote highlights that the complexity and uniqueness of mental phenomena cannot be fully explained by the seamless interconnections within thought processes alone. It implies that mental states are not merely the sum of their parts, but involve an intrinsic complexity that resists straightforward categorization or reduction to simpler elements, challenging simpler deterministic models of understanding the mind. Quote 54. The point is rather that when we use the concepts of belief, desire, and the rest, we must stand prepared, as the evidence accumulates, to adjust our theory in the light of considerations of overall cogency. The constitutive ideal of rationality partly controls each phase in the evolution of what must be an evolving theory. This statement underlines the dynamic and evolving nature of our understanding of mental states and the theories we build around them. It stresses that concepts like belief and desire are not static, but must be adaptable as new evidence comes to light, guided by a broader commitment to rational coherence and theoretical integration. This ongoing adjustment reflects a sophisticated understanding of mental phenomena as complex and contingent, requiring theories that can evolve and adapt over time. Quote 55. An arbitrary choice of translation scheme would preclude such opportunistic tempering of theory. Put differently, A right arbitrary choice of a translation manual would be of a manual acceptable in the light of all possible evidence, and this is a choice we cannot make. Here, the emphasis is on the limitations inherent in any theoretical framework that seeks to understand mental phenomena. The quote argues against the possibility of a definitive or final translation scheme for interpreting mental states, suggesting instead that any theoretical approach must remain open to revision and sensitive to new data. This openness is crucial for maintaining the flexibility needed to adapt theoretical models in light of ongoing research and evidence. Quote 56. Richard Rorty has recently aimed to represent the ideas expressed in this familiar passage as an aberration, something that could be removed while leaving the basic thrust of Davidson's philosophy undamaged and indeed purified. This passage points to a philosophical debate concerning the interpretation and importance of certain ideas within the broader context of Davidson's work. As critiqued by Richard Rorty, it suggests a tension between preserving the core of Davidson's philosophical contributions and re-evaluating aspects that may seem inconsistent or peripheral. The debate encapsulates a significant aspect of philosophical discourse, where interpretations can vary dramatically and lead to deep divisions regarding the fundamental understanding of a philosopher's work. Quote 57. To begin on urging that Rorty's suspicions are misplaced, I am going to juxtapose the Davidsonian irreducibility claim with a parallel claim made by another 20th-century North American philosopher, Wilfrid Sellars, a claim expressed by Sellars in passages that, it seems to me, Rorty Baudelarizes, in a way that fits with his distaste for this and similar passages in Davidson. This quote introduces a comparative analysis between the philosophical positions of Davidson and Sellars concerning the irreducibility of mental phenomena, highlighting how Rorty's critique may misrepresent or simplify these complex philosophical debates. It sets the stage for a deeper exploration of the nuances and implications of these philosophers' theories, indicating a divergence in the interpretation that may affect the understanding and acceptance of their ideas within the philosophical community. Quote 58. What goes wrong in Kant's attempt at the equipoise is that the requirements that derive from the form of our sensibility are only partly embraced within the scope of the kind of unity affected by apperceptive spontaneity. This quote critiques Kant's philosophical approach, specifically his attempt to balance the sensory and intellectual elements of human cognition. It suggests that Kant did not fully integrate the sensory aspects of experience into the intellectual framework provided by the apperceptive spontaneity, which is the self-aware aspect of thought that unifies sensory input into coherent experience. The criticism implies that a more complete philosophical theory would fully incorporate these sensory requirements into its conceptual framework, thus avoiding the partial treatment Kant is accused of. Quote 59. If we are to accommodate that insight while conceiving the conditions in such a way that they are genuinely recognizable as conditions of our knowing things, we need to bring the conditions entirely inside the sphere of free intellectual activity. This statement posits that for a truly coherent philosophical system, all conditions that affect our knowledge must be considered within the realm of intellectual activity. It challenges the notion that external, non-intellectual conditions can independently influence knowledge, arguing instead for a model where intellectual processes wholly encompass the conditions for knowing. This approach seeks to internalize all factors affecting knowledge, highlighting the active role of intellect in shaping understanding. Quote 60. The problem is not with Kant's conception of apperceptive unity itself. The problem arises because he frames that conception within the claim that space and time are transcendentally ideal. Here, the critique shifts to Kant's framing of space and time as ideal, rather than his concept of apperceptive unity. This suggests that while Kant's idea of unifying consciousness, apperceptive unity, might be sound, his application of this idea within the context of his broader claims about the nature of space and time creates problems. The implication is that Kant's foundational assumptions about the nature of reality, particularly his treatment of space and time as constructs of the mind, undermine the effectiveness of his philosophical system. Quote 61. Hegelian talk of the pursuit of knowledge as the unconditioned activity of reason rejects the frame in which Kant puts his attempt at such a conception, not the conception itself. This quote highlights Hegel's departure from Kant in terms of how knowledge is pursued. While Kant construes knowledge within a framework that includes both intellectual and sensory conditions, Hegel views the pursuit of knowledge as an activity driven solely by reason, independent of any sensory or empirical conditions. This difference underscores a fundamental philosophical divergence about the nature of knowledge and reason. Quote 62. The way to protect the common-sense conception of empirically accessible reality as independent of us while retaining the critical insight is precisely to see our way to discarding that frame. The statement suggests that to maintain a practical, common-sense view of reality as something that exists independently of our perception or understanding, it is necessary to reject Kant's theoretical framework that posits reality as a construct influenced by our sensory and intellectual conditions. This perspective advocates for a philosophical approach that recognizes the autonomy of the empirical world from human cognition, while still appreciating the insights provided by critical philosophy regarding the interplay of perception and reality. Quote 63. What do really exist are the constituents of the scientific image that correspond to those merely apparent, ordinary objects, swarms of elementary particles, or something of the sort. Sellars contends that the real constituents of the world, in contrast to the ordinary objects we perceive daily, are better represented by the scientific conception of reality, such as swarms of elementary particles. This view challenges the ordinary perception of objects as being the fundamental elements of reality, instead suggesting that what we perceive are merely representations formed by more complex underlying scientific realities. Quote 64. Empirical cognition can be subject to genuinely external constraint only by way of impacts on our senses from those genuinely real items. This quote asserts that true external constraints on our cognition come directly from the interaction between our sensory apparatus and the underlying real entities of the scientific image, such as particles. Sellars suggests that sensory experiences shaped by these interactions are the only genuine external influences on our understanding, thereby emphasizing a physicalist view where cognition is influenced materially by the world. Quote 65. Sellars puts this forward as an interpretation for Kant's distinction between phenomenal objects, constituents of the manifest image, and things in themselves, which Sellars identifies with constituents of the scientific image. Sellars reinterprets Kant's distinction between phenomena, things as they appear, and noumena, things in themselves, by aligning the former with the manifest image and the latter with the scientific image. This approach reconfigures Kant's abstract philosophical distinction into a more tangible contrast between everyday perceptions and scientific understandings. Quote 66. In Sellars's view, the point of the aesthetic should be that our sensibility has its forms in its own right, independently of its cooperation with the understanding. Sellars criticizes Kant's integration of sensibility and understanding, proposing instead that sensibility should be viewed as having its own forms independent of intellectual processes. This stance advocates for a conceptual separation, where sensibility does not merely serve as a passive recipient of the understanding's shaping, but has its own autonomous structure and function. Quote 67. This picture, which Sellars thinks is the one Kant should have accepted, seems to cast the forms that our sensibility contributes to empirical cognition in the role of mere givens or immediacies, brutally alien to the understanding. Sellars suggests that Kant's theory would be more consistent if it portrayed the forms of sensibility as innate and unrelated to intellectual operations, thus seeing them as givens that influence cognition but remain fundamentally separate from the understanding. This interpretation emphasizes a rigid separation between sensory and intellectual components of cognition, suggesting that our basic sensory frameworks operate independently of our intellectual frameworks. Quote 68. In Sellars's view, which he takes to be Kant's, the whole truth about an item that is a sensation is captured by a characterization that relates it solely to the subject as a modification of its state. Sellars interprets Kant's view of sensations as being entirely subjective, suggesting that sensations are merely states of the individual experiencing them without any necessary relation to external reality. This interpretation focuses on the internal and subjective nature of sensations, aligning them more with the conditions of the perceiving subject than with the objects being perceived. Quote 69. Start with a representation acquired through sensibility. It may or may not be one that, because the higher faculty is operative in its constitution, has the status of a cognition. This quote reflects on the dual potential of sensory inputs. They can either rise to the level of cognition if processed by higher mental faculties, or remain mere sensations without cognitive status. It underscores Kant's idea that cognition is not merely about receiving sensory data, but involves an active processing that imbues these data with meaning and understanding. Quote 70. But we can redescribe that same item in a way that abstracts from its being a representation, which, if it is a cognition or cognition enabler, is its intentionality. Here, the process of abstracting from the representational aspect of sensory inputs to focus solely on their sensational character is discussed. This abstraction allows for a different understanding of sensory experiences, focusing on their effect on the subject rather than their content or accuracy in representing external reality. Quote 71. In this picture, what provides for an intuition, say, to belong to sensory consciousness, is not apportioned to an item other than one whose characteristics provide for the intuition to be of an object. This statement critiques Sellars's separation of sensory and intellectual components of perception, suggesting instead that intuitions, sensory experiences that provide direct acquaintance with objects, inherently include both sensory and intellectual elements. It argues for a more integrated view of perception, where sensory data and intellectual processing are not distinct, but are parts of a unified cognitive process. Quote 72. There is no backsliding here from what I described as the fundamental Kantian insight, that sensibility alone does not yield cognition. The fundamental Kantian principle that mere sensory input does not constitute cognition is reaffirmed. This emphasizes the necessity of intellectual involvement to elevate raw sensory data to the level of meaningful cognition, supporting the idea that understanding is not passive, but requires active mental engagement. Quote 73. This belongs with the fact that the unfolding of life Hegel has given so far has been for us, rather than for the consciousness whose experience we are about to witness. This quote highlights Hegel's methodological approach in the phenomenology of spirit, where the development of consciousness and its transitions are presented from the perspective of an observer, or for us, rather than from the internal perspective of the consciousness experiencing these changes. This approach allows Hegel to discuss the evolution of consciousness and its stages objectively, providing insights into the dynamics of self-awareness and self-other relations that the consciousness itself may not be aware of as it undergoes these transformations. Quote 74. The object of consciousness turned out to be the freely self-developing notion, in which consciousness was in principle enabled to see nothing other than itself. Here, Hegel advances the idea that the ultimate object of consciousness is the notion, or the conceptual understanding of self that develops freely and reflexively. This conception suggests that consciousness comes to realize itself fully through a dialectical process, where it sees itself in its objects, embodying Hegel's idea that self-consciousness is achieved through recognizing oneself in the other or in external objects, thus overcoming the separation between subject and object. Quote 75. Self-consciousness is, as we already know, desire überhaupt. In this passage, Hegel characterizes self-consciousness fundamentally as desire, indicating that the nature of self-consciousness is to constantly seek out and negate its otherness as it strives toward self-realization. This relentless desire drives the dialectical process of consciousness, propelling it through various stages of development and recognition, culminating in the realization of its own self-awareness and autonomy. Quote 76. Self-consciousness achieves its satisfaction only in another self-consciousness. This famous Hegelian assertion posits that self-consciousness can only truly understand and fulfill itself through the recognition of another self-consciousness. This mutual recognition is essential for the development of a complete self-awareness, as each consciousness comes to recognize its own nature and freedom reflected in the other. This interaction is foundational to Hegel's social and ethical theories, emphasizing the intersubjective basis of self-conscious identity and freedom. Quote 77. The simplest way to effect this required overcoming of otherness would be by reducing to nothingness the independent other. Hegel discusses the radical attempt to achieve self-certainty by annihilating the otherness that confronts self-consciousness. This reflects the dramatic existential and ontological struggle inherent in achieving self-conscious autonomy. Hegel suggests that the negation of the other is not a literal destruction, but a philosophical overcoming, where the independence of the other is acknowledged but integrated into a higher unity of self-consciousness, preserving the freedom and distinctiveness of both selves in the synthesis. Quote 78. That leads into the third stage. Virtue is a de-individualized descendant of the law of the heart. This quote elaborates on the evolution of the concept of virtue in Hegel's philosophy, positioning it as a progression from more personal and subjective notions like the law of the heart. This transformation reflects Hegel's broader theme of the dialectical movement from individual subjective experiences to more universal and de-individualized concepts. Hegel's analysis suggests that as consciousness matures, it moves beyond narrowly personal or self-centered frameworks toward a more collective and objective understanding of ethical and moral principles. Quote 79. Consciousness learns from this that it was mistaken in supposing individuality was what stood in the way of its achieving a conception of happenings with the significance of intentional actions. Here, Hegel addresses a common misconception in consciousness that the presence of individuality or personal identity obstructs the understanding of actions as meaningful or intentional. He proposes that consciousness must recognize individual actions as part of a broader, interconnected framework to truly grasp their intentional nature. This insight marks a critical development in the dialectical progression of consciousness, emphasizing the need to integrate personal identity with a more holistic view of agency and action. Quote 80. Consciousness in VB is working towards being so much as entitled to the idea that something's happening in objective reality can be itself acting. This statement outlines the philosophical endeavor of consciousness in Hegel's framework to grasp and justify the notion that occurrences within objective reality can possess agency or perform actions. This conceptual struggle reflects Hegel's exploration of how consciousness reconciles subjective intentions with the objective reality of actions and their consequences, highlighting the dynamic and complex interaction between internal desires and external realities. Quote 81. It is aware of the determinateness of its powers, but that does not figure for it as a limitation on its freedom. It is only a specificity in the space of possibilities that constitutes its being an agent at all. Hegel discusses the consciousness's recognition of its own capabilities and limitations not as restrictions, but as defining characteristics that enable action and agency. This recognition is crucial for consciousness to understand its own potential and the realistic boundaries of its freedom, situating its actions within the realm of possible and meaningful outcomes. Quote 82. If the idea of doing something is to have application, something needs to happen objectively, that is, for others, in the sense of being publicly available. This quote highlights a fundamental Hegelian principle about the nature of action and intentionality. Hegel argues that for an action to be recognized as such, it must manifest in a way that is observable and comprehensible to others, emphasizing the social and communal aspects of actions. This understanding underscores the external public dimension of private intentions, suggesting that true agency involves both subjective intent and objective recognition or validation. Quote 83. Now, Brandom seizes on this withholding of endorsement and exploits it in an explanation, which he attributes to Sellars, for the incorrigibility of looks statements. This quote highlights a critical interpretation by Brandom of Sellars' philosophy regarding the nature of looks statements, which are assertions about how things appear to an observer. Brandom suggests that such statements do not commit the speaker to the truth of what is observed. Thus, they are not correctable in the way factual assertions are. This interpretation opens up a nuanced understanding of perceptual claims within Sellars' broader framework, distinguishing between direct observational claims and the cognitive commitments they entail. Quote 84. But this reflects Brandom's failure to register the Sellarsian idea I have been documenting, the idea that when one says something of the form, X looks F, one reports the claim containing character of one's experience. Here, the criticism is that Brandom misinterprets Sellars' view on perceptual reports. Sellars actually posits that stating X looks F involves reporting an embedded claim within one's perceptual experience, which itself is a form of assertoric commitment. This interpretation underscores a deeper layer of cognitive engagement even in seemingly straightforward perceptual statements, highlighting the complex interplay between perception and cognition in Sellars' epistemology. Quote 85. Brandom's explanation of the incorrigibility of looks statements is not Sellarsian at all. This quote explicitly denies the accuracy of Brandom's interpretation of Sellars on the topic of looks statements, arguing that Brandom has fundamentally misunderstood Sellars' philosophical stance. This criticism points to significant differences in understanding key philosophical concepts between two major interpreters of Sellars, which impacts how Sellars' views on perception and statements of appearance are comprehended and taught. Quote 86. For an authentically Sellarsian account of first-person authority in saying how things look to one, we have to wait until the culmination of the first phase of the myth of Jones. Sellars addresses the issue in Farmer 59. This statement points forward to a more complete and authentic exposition of Sellars' views on the authority of first-person perceptual statements, which is fully developed later in his work. It suggests that understanding Sellars' complete view on this issue requires a comprehensive engagement with his broader philosophical narrative, particularly as it unfolds in his discussion of the myth of Jones. Quote 87. Sellars is not unperspicuously presenting Brandom's two-ply picture. He is, quite perspicuously, giving a preliminary account of how the knowledge-yielding capacity of experience, even experience of something as simple as color, presupposes knowledge of matters of fact other than those non-inferentially knowable by enjoying experiences of the kind in question. This highlights a fundamental aspect of Sellars' epistemology, where he argues that even simple perceptual experiences, such as seeing a color, involve a complex background of inferential knowledge and cognitive capacities. This view challenges simpler models of perception and asserts that our sensory experiences are deeply embedded within a broader framework of knowledge and understanding. Having the World in View. Essays on Kant, Hegel, and Sellars by John McDowell provides a thought-provoking synthesis of the philosophical approaches of Kant, Hegel, and Sellars, emphasizing the role of perceptual experience in our understanding of reality. By arguing for a view that resists both empirical reductionism and disconnected idealism, McDowell seeks to establish that the mind's engagement with the world is a matter of being open to rational constraint by reality itself. The essays collectively emphasize that understanding is not imposed on the world from outside, but emerges from the active participation of subjects in perceiving and conceptualizing reality.
Curious to dive into the mind of John McDowell? With StudyLab Pro's book GPT, it's possible. Ask questions, explore themes, and discover the depths of Having the World in View, essays on Kant, Hegel, and Sellars, in an entirely new way. Start your conversation now by clicking on our logo. And if you're hungry for more educational content, subscribe to our channel to keep discovering, learning, and growing. Want more than just videos? Click on our logo now to join us on our platform for multiple choice tests, in-depth content, and tools to help you ace your studies. Get started now.